is Tomas Petricek. I'm sort of doubly affiliated, so it might be a bit confusing. Partly, I'm in the institute that Evelina will be joining very soon, the Alan Turing Institute, which is a UK sort of data science research organization. Partly, I'm part of FSARP Works, which is a sort of consulting group around the FSARP programming language. And this talk is sort of going to be a blend of two things. One is that I'll say a couple of things about the project that we've been working on in the Alan Turing Institute, and that's the thing called the Gamma. The other part of the talk is that this is written in the FSARP language, so I'll say a bit about the FSARP side of things. And it has a very lofty title because that's what you need to get funding. But really, and that's what you need to get funding from these two nice organizations. So thank you. Really, it's going to start with some politics. So this used to be funny before it was reality. But there's this sort of buzzword that people use that's called post-fact. How many people have heard post-fact or post-truth? The idea is that in sort of very many modern sort of recent political debates, and that refers to the recent US presidential elections or the UK Brexit referendum, it really didn't matter too much whether something is a fact. It sort of mattered more how people felt about it. So the idea is that it's sort of harder and harder to make decisions or use factual claims in the decisions, and that's a bit sad. And I think when I sort of started thinking about facts, I had this experience where I was reading some article. I picked a different one here. So this is an article from 2007 when China overtook US on carbon emissions. I was actually reading one where someone in the Czech government was saying that there's way too many people going to universities and that's bad. They should all go to manufacturing because they were claiming that there's sort of above average university enrollment rate. And those are kind of claims that when you see them somewhere and you have some programming background, you're like, well, I wonder if this is true. Let me check this. And so in FSARP, there's this feature. How many people here have seen FSARP? Just a couple. That's good because this is one of the sort of nicest ways of exploring FSARP. There's a feature called type providers that makes it really, really easy to access data, work with data. So I'll give you one example. And just to make this a bit more exciting, I'm going to use this thing called Azure Notebooks to run the code. So this is Azure-hosted Jupyter or IPython notebooks where you can create notebooks, and I've created one already. Yeah, let's do reload. And you can sort of mix some code with some descriptions and run things. But you do need internet for that. I think there is internet. It's just a bit slow at the moment. If it doesn't work, that's all right because I can run it in a normal sort of source code editor as well. So, but let's try because this would be a nice thing if it worked. So I'll just run disconnect and connect again, and maybe it will work this time. So Azure Notebooks, I'm using this because if you haven't used FSARP before, this is really easy way to sort of play with it and just try running a couple of commands in your browser. And while this loads, so you can also share them, which is nice if you sort of want to go through some tutorials that someone has written already. And now that it's loaded, I have sort of two cells with some FSARP code. that's really just boring setup. The first one references a package called fslab, and the second one just loads a bunch of things and opens a couple of required namespaces. And this should produce a massive list of warnings that I haven't figured out how to disable. But when this happens, I can start, and the type provider I'm going to be using here is for accessing data from the World Bank, which is a nice demo. And World Bank is this international organization that collects a lot of data about a lot of different countries, and they provide this data through a simple API that you can call. So I think this should eventually finish, but let's see if I can sort of start typing here. If no, I'll have to switch to a normal editor. Maybe I'll do that and try this later on. So here I just have exactly the same code, and what I was going to show you there is the sort of really nice idea in type providers is that when you're working against some data and you type dot, in lots of programming languages, this will give you help based on what members are available. But here, it can actually give you help based on what data is available. So while this is finished, I can run this thing, and then if I ask for help here, I'll eventually get the same thing. So here I can now say, now I'm interested in US and China, so I can select United States, and then I can say, now give me all the different indicators, and it actually comes up with a list based on what data the World Bank has. So if I want to look at carbon emissions, I can say CO2, and then I can run this, and it will connect to the internet again, which is why it's slow, and give me my data. So can I now run it here as well? Well, bad luck with the notebooks, anyway. So the other nice thing in F# is this pipe operator that basically means send the thing on the left to the thing on the right, and this way I can create a chart that shows the change in carbon emissions, and this one was for the United States. So what I want to do is something a bit more exciting, and I'm just going to use a demo here where I take a couple of different countries, and here I picked UK, US, and China, and then here I'm specifying the indicator that I want to look at. And let's first start with carbon emissions in kilotons. And if I run it, again, I'll get the chart that compares China, US, UK on carbon emissions in total. And here you can see that China really is overtaking the two other countries. But the fun thing, or the really interesting thing is that it's sort of hard to say what that means. And you can contrast that number with total emissions to this indicator, which is per capita. So basically, how much is it for one person in the country? And if you look at this, then you'll see that actually US is still worse polluter than China. So this kind of data exploration, I think, is something that I, as a sort of programmer who knows how to work with data, I'm really familiar with, and I'm sort of curious to test these things. If you want to have a look at more F# type providers, it's really nice way to sort of start playing with F#, so you can try the Azure notebooks. Better do it when you're online. And there's a page, fslab.org, with a bunch of links to documentation. And I've also done a Pluralsight video that uses type providers together with C# just as a sort of introduction. That one is more about JSON, XML, and so on. So one of the things that I was sort of wondering is, with type providers, I as a programmer can really easily get to data, but could we make it even more accessible so that we can sort of convince people that facts are interesting? And more people in the media do sort of work with data. So this is a lovely map from the a lovely chart from the New York Times, looking at the history of the Olympic Games, and the height of these sort of ribbons is how many medals they've got. So you can see, for example, around here, there's this funny peak where US boycotted Olympic Games in Moscow, and then vice versa. So this is really sort of simple visual that tells quite interesting story about the world. You can see the world wars there as well. But it does have a lot of problems because this is really hard to do. So not only you can't really just sort of run the code they gave you really easily, you can't create a chart like this unless you know D3, R, JavaScript, and a bunch of other things. The reader cannot really say, what if I only cared about athletics? And there's even with something simple as this, you can make it, you can sort of tweak the facts. For example, you can count rowing as 8 gold medals, or football as 11, or whatever number there is. And that really changes your story. So how can we make this more transparent? And this is the project that I've been working on, and that's what I'm going to show you. So here the idea is, could we take exactly the same sort of style of working, but rather than having it as a developer-centric thing, could we make it sort of more user-friendly and easier for non-programmers? So this is just sort of using the same style to navigate through some indicators. And here I'm still doing this using dot. And when I get my data, I can say, create a line chart with the data. But the one nice thing this is already doing for me is that I get a live preview as I'm typing it. And if you look at the script that you have to write to do it, it's really not very complicated. You need to understand that dot means sort of select thing. And I only have one keyword, which is let. So that's sort of as simple as the language can be. And the idea with this is not really that sort of we would just give this as a tool to people. The idea is that whenever you're reading some article, here's an example, and it has some chart in it, like a comparison of carbon emissions between China and the US, we would give you a sort of button to see the source code and encourage the reader to think about the data critically and maybe sort of let them explore how exactly it's done. Now, I don't really expect that sort of a regular newspaper reader will always be interested, I want to see the source code. But you can also bind some of the elements in the script to a UI. So here, for example, if I want to see, so China is the red one here, we can change the US. And here, when I say Italy, this drop-down is not like a special UI element. It's just a part of the code where previously I was selecting using dot. Now I'm selecting using drop-down. But it's modifying the program. And if I change it to Italy, then it doesn't change the label automatically. So it's not perfect. But now you can see the total carbon emissions of Italy, which aren't very high. It would get more interesting if we switch to the per capita. And in per capita, blue is Italy. It's sort of going down in recent years. So the idea really here is, can we sort of build a little visualization library, data access library that people can use in browser, in JavaScript, embed in their articles to make data transparent. And the way I'm doing it is using this amazing project called Fable that compiles F# to JavaScript. So what I was showing you before, all this stuff, things like sort of completion here, this is all running in the browser, but it's all written in F#. And it's a little scripting language that I wrote. And Fable is sort of the latest, greatest evolution of F# to JavaScript. And it has a couple of really good things. It integrates well with the modern sort of NPM ecosystem to the extent that people like me can't keep up with it. But if you know JavaScript, you'll be able to use sort of all the tools that are there. It has really sort of welcoming community. So whenever I get annoyed and go on the Fable Gitter and I say, bloody hell, this doesn't work, help me out, someone's there and points me to a documentation page that they've written just the day before. So, and it does have this sort of F# style where there are sort of core logic you can write in a really nice functional style, but then all the sort of messy DOM handling you do in a very sort of pragmatic way. So that's Fable, and I'll just show you one more thing where I sort of thought, well, you can use this dot to explore things like carbon emissions, select different country, but how far can we take this? Could you actually write an entire data exploration, data aggregation with it? Or could I sort of say, filter Olympic medals and actually see my values here? The other thing that I sort of spend a lot of time thinking about is this gap between programming and spreadsheets. So this is completely made up chart. So in contrast to the previous talk here, I just make stuff up. But the idea here is spreadsheets like Excel, they're really, really simple and you can do lots of simple things with them, but a huge number of people can do it. Here in the programming world, we can solve any crazy complicated tasks, but it's really only a few people. So can we sort of find something in the middle where it would be a bit more like programming while still really being sort of accessible? And one nice thing that I think really is important in Excel is that you always see your data. So I'm going to switch to another demo here, and this time I'm going to need internet again, but hopefully it will happen. Here I've got a list of all Olympic medals ever awarded. It's just a CSV file, but pretty big one. And as I type, whenever my code is sort of valid, it will give me a preview based on what I've done already. So if I say filter data, and I say I just want games that, or medals from the Rio Olympic Games, then you can see it's filtered out and my preview tells me only the Rio medals. And if you prefer not to type code, you can also just use the UI that will sort of write the code for you. And I say group the data, my key, let's count who is the athlete with the largest number of medals. I can group the data by athlete, And for every athlete, I could count all medals they had, or I can add another aggregation, and I can sum the number of gold medals. So as I'm doing this, I always get a preview, and then I can sort it. So if I say sorted by, what's my sorting key? Sorted by the number of gold medals, then you'll see Michael Phelps has 6, Kati Ledecky 5. No, that's the total. That's the total. And if you look at just golds, it's this or that. So here the idea is, if you look at the code, all I'm doing is just typing dot. But I can do fairly complicated scripts. And if I use the result in some article, I can embed it, and everyone will see how exactly I calculated it. So the full version of the demo isn't really much longer. It's just this. I added paging and a chart. And this is your chart with top medalists from Rio. So this is the sort of the Gamma project and the JavaScript component that you can get from npm or GitHub and use. And now I'll say a bit more about the implementation behind it, because I think that's really where this is another area where F# really made my life a lot easier. One really nice functional idea that I'm using came from the Elm language, it's sort of called Elm-style architecture, or it's a general pattern that you can use in lots of other languages. Here I just sort of implemented the core idea in F#. And the idea is, when you're creating some user interface, all you need to do is to write 2 functions. So you need to define a bunch of types. We'll have one type that defines my current state. So basically, type that a value that stores everything I need to render the page. And I'll need another type that represents an event, when something happens, like I click on this button. And then you need to write a function that takes the current state, an event that happened, and calculates new state. You remove an item from a to-do list, an event happens, remove 5th item, you calculate a new list of items by removing one. And then you need a function that basically takes the current state and renders the page. And this bit I'll ignore for now. Take the current state, render the page, and the magic that Elm came up with is that when event happens, you render a new page, you don't just replace the entire DOM with the new DOM, because that would be very inefficient. It calculates sort of a minimal change that it has to do and updates, actually mutates the page. But the nice thing is you just write 2 functions that don't mutate any state, return a new thing, and it binds to the user interface for you. So how hard can this be? I'm going to show you a little demo. And here I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code with the Ionite plugin, because this works. This is the best tool for playing with Fable. And I'll make it bigger in a second. And I'll also need to run this from command line. So this is a magic command that you just have to copy from the documentation page. That is there because it's sort of integrated with all the different JavaScript stuff. But what it will do, and you can define a shortcut if you're too lazy, it will run a background compiler, watch for changes, and host your website at the undisclosed URL. There it is. So if I now go to my local host, here's my to-do list, except it doesn't do anything. So I don't want to see this. I want this bigger. And here's the source code for my to-do list. So I have an event, update, and a model. That's my state. And currently, the only thing it does is that when I type something here, it will remember what I typed. So what I can do next is to say, well, I'll probably need to keep in my state the list of items. This first work item and second work item, they're just hard-coded here at the moment. So I'm going to say items is a list of strings. And when I do it, I get an error here because I haven't initialized it. So initially, my items is going to be first and second. And then I'll update my rendering function. So this is the one that, given the current state, produces an HTML. And rather than having hard-coded two li elements, I'll say for item in state items, for everyone generate li element, where the text is actually going to be that item. And I saved it just now. If I switch back, it already reloaded. So when I hit that really ugly long command, that's because it's integrated with other things like Webpack that reloads here. So now I just need some more code to actually be able to add things. So I'm going to add another event, say named add. And I'll trigger add when you click on a button below. And the nice thing in F# is that as I did this, my update function doesn't handle this new case I just added. And the compiler tells me, look, here you're missing a case. You need to fix your update function so that when add happens, you return a new state. So I'll erase the input, and items are going to be all the old items together with the new input. So now, and it reloaded in the background, I can say third and edit, and fourth and edit, and so on. So I'm not going to finish it. Removing is left as an exercise for the reader, but the point is, the architecture makes the sort of structure really simple. You just need to define your events, define your state. And that's what was powering this sort of preview where you just need to figure out what are my states. So there's the source code. I need to remember which is the selected tab. My events are sort of all the different menu items that I can click on, or clicking on these remove buttons and so on. So this is one really sort of one part where F# really helped because it made it a lot easier to write the UI. And I'll just quickly show you one more example where we sort of thought, well, it's really nice when you show people charts, but will they care? And it turns out that people sort of skim over the chart and then they're like, yeah, whatever chart, you show me some numbers. Okay. So there's, and now I'll just have to find it somewhere. There it is. So one way to make these charts more exciting is to actually not show people the results immediately, but ask them to make a guess. So this is the UK government spending, and here you have to make a guess. And oh no, what did I do? Okay. Well, here it's back. So the idea is we'll show you a blank chart. You have to make a guess. And only when you make a guess, we'll actually show you the right results. So here, for example, you have to say, what does the government spend money on? Does anyone, so what do you think is the sort of largest pot of money? Where does the largest pot of money go? Who thinks economic affairs? Who thinks social protection? Who thinks health? Who thinks general public services? Who thinks education? So I think health was the largest one, then social protection, and then I'll sort of guess randomly. And then you can say, what's the actual truth? So once you make your guess, you sort of acknowledge what you think, and then we'll show you what the numbers actually tell you. So it's social protection is the largest one, mostly because this also includes pensions. And this is another area where FSAR was really useful, because putting these charts together turns out to be a pretty tricky problem. And most people who have done something like this before have been using libraries like D3, which are really powerful, but not the easiest thing on earth. So this chart, I actually created it in F# using Fable, using a little library that lets you compose different chart components. And the key idea behind the library is to define what a chart is using a couple of composable primitives. So here I'm saying a shape or a chart can be a line, and then it needs a list of x and y values. Or it can be a shape, sort of filled area, and then it needs list of x and y's. Or it can be layered, where you just take a bunch of different shapes and automatically overlay them by sort of aligning their scales. So this is the sort of clever thing that's happening behind the scene, but it lets you define these charts with just a couple of lines of code and composes them automatically for you. I'm going to wrap up, and if you have questions, I can show you more demos. In summary, so I think this is really important. I think the sort of the trend that people ignore statistics and ignore the data, that's a fairly bad trend, and we can probably find lots of interesting ways to make facts and data more exciting, and that's the sort of point of the project. On the more technical side, I started by showing you a demo of F# type providers. If you're doing anything with data, have a look at type providers, and you can do that on the Azure Notebooks. And I showed you Fable, which is a really nice way of running F# as JavaScript in the browser. It integrates well with the Elm-style architecture, and people have been using it for lots of interesting things. And finally, I think the really sort of strong part of F# is this bit where you can define a type to model your domain, be it charts or events in your page or the state, because then that simple domain really captures what you're doing. And that's it. Thank you.